Some residents in East Boston are trying to protect a piece of neighborhood history from redevelopment. They're collecting signatures to block the demolition of two brick buildings on Maverick Street near the commercial center at Maverick Square. To tell us about the campaign is one of the organizers from the Jeffries Point neighborhood, Dan Bailey. Dan, thank you very much for being with us. First of all, talk about the setting for where these buildings are. This is Maverick Street, corner of Chelsea Street. Paint the picture a bit.
So this is the northwest corner of Maverick Square, and Maverick Square is sort of the commercial core of East Boston, and it's also one of the earliest areas of East Boston to be developed. The development in Maverick Square dates all the way back to 1833. But over the years, a lot of the historic buildings in Maverick Square have been lost to fire and demolition. And these two buildings at the northwest corner of the square are really some of the last physical reminders that we have of the 19th century architecture in Maverick Square.
Well, these also look not very typical because East Boston, you think of three-deckers, wood frame houses, and these look almost as if a piece of the Back Bay or Beacon Hill got misplaced. The buildings tell a story. What is that story?
Yeah, so it's actually a fascinating story. These buildings were constructed sort of at a very interesting time in East Boston's history. It was sort of at the tail end of this phase of East Boston's early history that was really dominated by shipbuilding in the neighborhood. And that shipbuilding industry is really what led to the growth of the neighborhood during that early era, really between 1830s and 1870 when these buildings were built. And most of the development during that time were single-family homes, which is something that East Boston's no longer really known for. And the reason for that is because after the shipbuilding era came to a close, there was sort of an influx of immigration to the neighborhood. It took on more of a working-class character, sort of the character that people associate with it today. And a lot of those buildings were altered, divided into apartments and turned into what we think of today as three-deckers. These buildings are unique because they're so well preserved. They're sort of examples of that early history where they really are still single-family, have the appearance at least of single-family townhomes.
Now, if you look at that location right now, it's one thing to talk about the buildings in isolation, but if you look at that whole corner, starting with the funeral home building, the parking area, and the buildings themselves, the way they're currently used, it looks kind of like a hodgepodge.
Yeah, so I think it's that corner certainly exemplifies some of the demolitions that have happened over the years in Maverick Square. So these two 19th century buildings are really the only buildings left on that block that date from that era. At one time, the entire block was full of similar buildings. So I think it's really an example of some of the challenges that we face in Maverick Square in terms of redevelopment. And I think a lot of people in the neighborhood are excited to see this corner of Maverick Square redeveloped because, again, as you say, it's a lot of the site right now is a defunct funeral home and a parking lot. Without a lot of historic value. I think people would be excited to see something built there that would really revitalize this corner of Maverick Square. But at the same time, I think an important part of that development needs to be preserving the historic buildings that are on site as well.
This is BNN News, and we're talking about redevelopment and preservation in East Boston with the Jeffries Point resident, Dan Bailey. Dan, one of the other things that you're arguing here is that the plan to put a kind of a retail commercial structure at that corner would be at odds with the city's planning for this area. Explain how that comes out.
That's correct, yeah. So the development proposal for this site is, it involves, of course, demolishing these buildings, but the proposed replacement building is really a sort of a two-story, low-density, really suburban-style retail building that many people in the community feel is ill-suited for this site. It's at the corner of a vibrant urban business district. Really we'd like to see something a little more ambitious at this site, and I think it provides an opportunity for the city to begin implementing a lot of the planning that they've put forth in the Imagine Boston 2030 plan, and that includes things like enhancing neighborhood character, preparing for the effects of climate change, and an emphasis on mixed-use buildings in transit-accessible areas. So this site is immediately next to a Blue Line T-stop, and it's really calling out for a mixed-use building, something that would include some housing that would help address some of the housing shortages that we're experiencing in the neighborhood, as well as some retail on the ground floor that would help really vitalize this part of Maverick Square.
Well, the developer's proposing a commercial building. It's near a commercial area, so it's not totally out of character. But on the other hand, when you lose these historic buildings, how does that feel to you?
I think it's a terrible loss to the neighborhood. I mean, these buildings are not only significant to the community and an important reminder of our past, they also place the community on a continuum with the past and allow us to better understand where we are in the present and also provide a way for us to imagine the future. So, as they say, it's hard to know where you're going if you don't know where you've been. And at the same time, they also they provide a great opportunity for future economic vibrancy in the area. So there's been a lot of studies that show that historic buildings provide a lot of unique opportunities that aren't afforded by new construction buildings. They tend to host more independent businesses, more new businesses, more women and minority-owned businesses, and they also tend to draw people to a business district. And that kind of holds true if you think about business districts in Boston in general. So if you think about some of the most successful and vibrant business districts in Boston, whether that's Hanover Street in the North End, or Tremont Street in the South End, or even places like Coolidge Corner or Brookline Village. All of those places, I think, are so successful because they've found ways to preserve and reuse a lot of their existing historic architecture, in addition to introducing some new buildings. So they have a real vibrant mix of old and new buildings, and I think that's key to their success. And I think that kind of idea should really guide our development in Maverick Square as well.
The city has delayed the demolition of these buildings, but time is running out on that. So what's going to happen next?
That's correct. So the Boston Landmarks Commission did decide that these buildings are preferably preserved, and they invoked a 90-day demolition delay. But that delay expires on November 20th. So time is ticking on that. And part of the point of the petition that we've organized is to try to petition elected officials and the mayor in particular to ask that he intervene to prevent the issuance of demolition delays for these properties once the delay expires on November 20th.
So if people want to find out any more about the campaign, there's some way they can follow up with that?
Yes, so we have a Facebook group called Save Eastie's Historic Townhomes, and they can also sign on to the petition, which is on change.org under Save Eastie's History.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Dan Bailey. We'll have more news in just a moment.